At every Mass, there are 4 main Eucharistic prayers that the priest has to choose from. The Eucharistic prayer is the prayer that the priest prays from the time you kneel down to the time you stand up. Eucharistic prayer number 1 is the longest of the 4, and even if you're not an expert in the 4 Eucharistic prayers, you would recognize it as soon as you hear the priest say the long list of names of saints in that prayer, which is unique to that prayer. And there are 7 women who made the cut of those. There's really 2 lists of saints in that Eucharistic prayer. They're all apostles and early martyrs. And you recognize them as soon as I say it. Felicity, Perpetua, Agatha, Lucy, Agnes, Cecilia, Anastasia. Well, our saint for today is one of the 7 women who made the cut, Saint Agnes. You would recognize Saint Agnes in artwork by seeing her portrayed holding a palm branch and a lamb, and she holds a lamb as a sign of her virginal innocence. She was born in 291 to a rich Christian family in Rome. She was very beautiful, and as a young girl she felt a desire to consecrate her life to Jesus, so she promised Jesus that she would keep her virginity for him alone. But because she was so beautiful, many men wanted to marry her, and they came pursuing her, and every time a new man proposed to her, she said, "My only spouse is Jesus Christ." And after a while, they got very angry at her for rebuffing their advances. And this was a time when Christians were being persecuted. And so they reported her as a Christian to the prefect of Rome. And to persecute her and to make a mockery of her beauty and her chastity, he ordered her to be paraded through the streets naked. But when he did that, a miracle happened. As soon as they took her clothes off, her hair began to grow very rapidly, and within a minute, her hair covered the front and the back of her body. And every man who tried to look on her with lust as she was paraded through the streets was blinded by a bright light. They attempted to martyr her by burning her at the stake, but the flames, first the wood wouldn't light, and then the flames wouldn't touch her. Finally, she was killed by the sword. The executioner's hand trembled as he had to kill this young woman who had no fear of dying for Jesus, and the early Christians who saw her die wiped up her blood with cloths, which they distributed as relics of this holy martyr. Saint Agnes is today the patron saint of a much maligned virtue, the virtue of chastity. A lot of people confuse chastity with celibacy. Do you all know the difference between the two? They're not the same, are they? Some people are called to celibacy. Priests and nuns, young people preparing for marriage, widows and widowers unless they get remarried. Those people are called to celibacy, which is abstaining completely from sexual relations. However, everyone is called to chastity, including married people. Everybody is called to chastity. And sometimes people are shocked to hear that because they think chastity is celibacy, but it's not. Everybody is called to chastity. And chastity is the virtue that frees us up to love according to God's plan for human sexuality. God has a very specific plan for human sexuality, and when we have the virtue of chastity, we're free to love according to that plan. That plan does not include sex before marriage or outside of marriage. That plan does not include looking at people as if they were objects. It does not include pornography. That plan does not include sexual acts between people of the same sex. That plan does not include artificial contraception, not even in marriage. All excluded from the plan. And if the world is still here in 500 years, the Catholic Church will still be here proclaiming those parts of God's plan, even if the world tells us we're crazy. The Church will still be proclaiming the truth about sexuality. But God's plan is not just a bunch of no's either. God's plan does include the free, total, faithful, and fruitful gift of self between a husband and a wife married in the Catholic Church. And that is a very beautiful thing, which God's plan affirms. When we go against God's plan for sexuality, when we don't live the virtue of chastity, it leads to heartache, it leads to emotional wounds. More and more psychologists are talking about the anxiety and depression that they're finding in young people participating in the hookup culture. You cannot break God's plan or go against it and expect to thrive and be happy. It doesn't work that way. When we do follow God's plan for sexuality and live the virtue of chastity, it leads to peace, it leads to a sense of order in our souls, and it leads to much joy in life. St. Josemaria Escrivá once said, "When you decide firmly to lead a clean life, chastity will not be a burden on you, it will be a crown of triumph." Those of us who want to live this virtue, those of us who want to attain this crown of triumph, can expect mockery from the world. But you know why people in the world mock the virtue of chastity? Because it helps to ease their guilty conscience because of the ways they're violating that virtue. But great saints like St. Agnes, who died for the virtue of chastity, speak to us from beyond the grave and say to us, forget about the world. The world is crazy. The world is upside down. The world is so messed up because of its own wisdom. Follow Jesus. Follow the teachings of Jesus' church. They're even worth dying for. And we can find the courage to follow those teachings and to live virtues as controversial as chastity by looking at the example of great and heroic saints like St. Agnes, who preferred to die rather than to violate chastity and to sin against Jesus. Through her intercession and her example, we can be victorious in living out this virtue, which leads to peace and joy. Saint Agnes, pray for us.